It started like any other early spring morning on the outskirts of the small, sun-baked town of Dry Creek. The rolling plains that surrounded the town were vast, dotted with ranches that stretched beyond the horizon, their boundaries marked by nothing more than faded wooden posts and the occasional cattle guard. My ranch had stood there for over a decade, a modest but thriving spread of land with a few dozen cattle, a weathered red barn, and an old farmhouse that had seen its fair share of storms. The property was mine outright, bought long before the new wave of suburban expansion began creeping into the area. But change, as it often does, arrived quietly at first: whispers of a new development down the road, rumors of a freshly minted homeowners association trying to bring order to what they called an untamed district. I had shrugged it off. HOAs were for cookie-cutter subdivisions with identical mailboxes and perfectly trimmed lawns, not for open ranchland that had stood for generations. At least, that's what I thought. The first sign of trouble came in the form of an email. A polite but condescending notice from the Dry Creek Meadows HOA stating that my property, according to their revised jurisdictional map, now fell within their boundaries. I had never signed anything, never attended a meeting, never even seen these people before. The message demanded I pay a $500 initial compliance assessment and attend an orientation meeting. I ignored it, assuming it was a scam or a clerical error. 2 weeks later, they made their move. I woke up to the distant clanging of metal. At first, I thought it was my neighbor moving his old stock trailer, but when I stepped outside, the reality hit me like a kick from a spooked horse. A crew of workers, unfamiliar faces in bright yellow vests, was driving steel fence posts deep into the ground along my property line. Heavy-duty chain-link fencing was being unrolled, stretching like a cold, silver scar across the wild openness that had always been mine to roam. By noon, half my access points were blocked. By dusk, the entire ranch was encircled. There was no warning, no knock at my door, no paperwork handed over for me to sign. They had installed a perimeter fence, 6 feet high, topped with twisted wire, around my land as if it were some delinquent corner lot in a subdivision. The only entrance left was a newly installed iron gate near the main road, and on it, a sign, Dry Creek Meadows HOA, access restricted. There was a key lock on the gate, one I had never seen before. I called the number on the sign, my voice tight with frustration. A woman answered, her tone dripping with artificial courtesy. She explained, with the kind of legalese that makes your blood boil, that the HOA had assumed stewardship of adjacent lands to maintain safety and property values, and that my noncompliance with their earlier notice had necessitated temporary containment measures. Containment, like my home, my livelihood, was some kind of pest to quarantine. When I demanded access, she told me keys were only issued to members in good standing after their dues were paid. In other words, they wanted a ransom. For days, I was trapped in my own land. The gate was the only way out from my truck, and it remained firmly locked. I had to park outside the fence and walk a half-mile across a dry creek bed just to get groceries. Feed deliveries for the cattle were delayed. Friends and neighbors stopped by, shocked and confused, but the HOA representatives who occasionally drove by in their polished SUVs only offered tight smiles and clipboards. That's when I started digging deeper. Public records, county maps, and land deeds became my nightly reading material. It didn't take long to uncover the truth. The land where they'd built the new gate wasn't actually owned by the HOA. It was a narrow, forgotten parcel of property, a 30-foot strip that had been left out of a developer's plan decades ago. It wasn't part of their subdivision at all, it was its own, neglected lot, recently acquired by the HOA only through a murky tax auction. They had no legal right to fence my property, but they controlled the only access point because that strip touched the county road. For most people, this would have been the end of the line, a drawn-out legal battle, months of stress, and mounting costs. But I had a different plan. If the gate was the chokehold, then the thin strip of land was the artery. Whoever owned that land owned the access, the gate, and by extension, the upper hand. And then, almost like fate was smiling on me, an opportunity appeared. A notice on the county website, barely visible if you weren't looking for it, announced a pending foreclosure sale on that same strip of land. Apparently, the HOA had failed to keep up with the back taxes after their acquisition. The auction was in 3 weeks. The starting bid was insultingly low. I didn't tell a soul. Not the neighbors, not the workers I hired for the ranch, not even the few friends who were helping me plan a case. I kept paying the minimal, temporary access the HOA finally demanded for me to walk through their gate, all while planning my next move. Every evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the fence cast its long, cold shadow across my fields, I would walk that boundary line. I would run my fingers along the rough steel, listening to the distant lowing of cattle and the rustle of dry grass in the wind. It wasn't just a fence anymore. It was a challenge, a dare, a declaration that they thought they could own not just the land, but the spirit of the people who lived on it. And that was their mistake. 3 weeks later, I drove into the county courthouse with a cashier's check in hand and left as the rightful owner of the only strip of land connecting my ranch to the outside world. Along with it came the deed to the gate they had so proudly locked against me. The day I held that deed in my hands, the wind on my ranch felt different, warmer, lighter, almost triumphant. The strip of land that had been the choke point for my livelihood now belonged to me. It wasn't much to look at. A narrow, weed-choked patch of gravel and scrub brush, 30 feet wide and barely stretching half a mile, but its value wasn't in its beauty. Its power lay in control over the only legal access between the county road and the fenced prison the HOA had turned my ranch into. I drove out to the gate that same afternoon. The sun was hanging low, bleeding orange across the plains, casting long shadows over the silver chain link they had so arrogantly installed. Their padlock still hung there, smug in its simplicity. The metal was cool beneath my fingers, but for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel the usual frustration boiling up. Instead, I felt something sharper, anticipation. Because now, it wasn't their gate anymore. It was mine. Over the next several days, I made no sudden moves. I wanted them to believe nothing had changed. HOA board members continued their weekly rounds, driving their spotless white SUVs past my property, peering over clipboards as if assessing their dominion. I kept paying their temporary access fee to walk through, kept parking my truck outside and hauling supplies on foot, all while keeping my little purchase a secret. Then, a certified letter arrived at my door. It was a formal warning. Failure to pay membership dues would result in fines, legal action, and even more, containment enforcement. They had no idea that the very land their threats depended on had slipped out of their hands. The irony was almost poetic. I waited until a quiet Sunday morning, when the roads were empty and the HOA office was closed. Armed with a new, heavy-duty padlock and a sign of my own, I set out. The old padlock came off with a clean cut from my bolt cutters, the chain rattling to the ground like a snake shedding its skin. I swung the gate open wide, parked my truck squarely across it, and mounted my sign, "Private Property. Access by owner's permission only." And just like that, the balance shifted. Within 2 days, the phone calls began. First polite, then impatient, then downright hostile. They demanded explanations, demanded access, demanded that I return HOA property immediately. But it wasn't theirs anymore. Their carefully curated suburb, with its rows of cookie-cutter houses and pristine lawns, suddenly found itself fenced in, not me. My gate was now the only artery connecting their enclave to the county road, their school buses, their delivery trucks, even their garbage collection routes. I didn't block anyone entirely, not at first. That would have been cruel and reckless. Instead, I implemented a simple rule: anyone wishing to pass through the gate had to request permission in writing, and passage was only granted at certain hours, under my terms. What had been a one-sided power play became a stalemate, and the residents, many of whom had been silent or complicit in the HOA's overreach, were the first to feel the strain. Days turned into weeks, and the HOA board began to unravel. Emergency meetings were called. Flyers were stuffed into mailboxes urging collective action. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said I was planning to develop the land into a toll station, others claimed I was selling access rights to the highest bidder. The truth was simpler and far more satisfying. I was biding my time, letting their own bureaucracy strangle them. Deliveries to their neighborhoods slowed to a crawl. Trash trucks missed pickups. Contractors refused to work without guaranteed access. Parents fumed as their morning commutes doubled in length, forced to take back roads that added miles to their drives. The HOA, once a symbol of rigid order, became a circus of finger-pointing and late-night conference calls. And through it all, I remained silent. The tipping point came when one of their own, an ambitious, sharp-tongued board member known for her aggressive enforcement of petty rules, marched up to my gate one evening with a locksmith in tow. They tried to force it open, citing emergency community rights. I had anticipated this. The sheriff was already on standby, the deed ready in my hand. The confrontation was brief, humiliating for them, and entirely legal on my end. By the time the flashing lights disappeared down the road, the message was clear: the law was on my side now. After that, the calls took on a different tone. Less demanding, more desperate. Offers were made, first token compensation, then increasingly extravagant promises if I would just restore the status quo. But I wasn't interested in money. I was interested in respect, in accountability, and in making sure what had been done to me could never happen again. So I set my terms. If they wanted unrestricted access restored, the fence around my ranch had to come down, every inch of it. They had to publicly admit their overreach, reimburse me for every cent I had lost during their so-called containment measures, and formally release my property from any claim of HOA jurisdiction. Only then would I consider handing over a key. The standoff became the talk of Dry Creek. Local news outlets picked it up, framing it as a David and Goliath battle between a stubborn rancher and an overreaching suburban empire. Neighbors who had once looked at me with pity now waved as they drove by, their smiles tinged with a quiet sort of admiration. The fence that had been a symbol of my isolation became, strangely, a monument to my resolve. And yet, I knew this wasn't over. People like those running the HOA didn't give up easily. They thrived on control, on rules twisted to their own ends. If they couldn't strong-arm me legally, they would look for loopholes, allies, or ways to turn public opinion back in their favor. So I prepared for the next move. I had secured the gate, yes, but real victory would mean tearing down the fence they had raised, physically and symbolically. And that would require more than ownership. It would require outmaneuvering them entirely. The first cracks in their wall were beginning to show. Residents began to question their leaders, their newsletters filled with thinly veiled blame-shifting and desperate reassurances. Contractors filed complaints about withheld payments. Even the county commissioner, once a quiet ally to the HOA, started asking questions about how they had managed to fence off a private ranch without proper authorization. The tide was turning, and as the summer sun beat down on the dusty plains of Dry Creek, I knew the next chapter in this fight was about to unfold, one that would decide not just the fate of my ranch, but the balance of power in the entire development. The day of the hearing dawned gray and heavy, the kind of sky that seemed to mirror the weight of the weeks leading up to it. The HOA Hall, usually a place of mundane policy discussions and neighborhood squabbles, was packed beyond its usual capacity. Residents who had rarely bothered to attend were now seated in rows, some with folded arms, others with phones discreetly raised to record what many suspected would be a turning point for the entire community. At the center of it all sat the rancher, papers in hand, and a silence that spoke more than any outburst could. Karen arrived later than most, flanked by two other board members who had once been her staunch allies but now carried an unease in their posture. Her expression was fixed in that peculiar blend of indignation and performative calm, the mask of someone who had convinced themselves that control was still in their grasp. But the whispers in the room, the eyes that turned toward her with something closer to resentment than respect, hinted that the tide had already shifted. The hearing began with the formalities, roll calls, procedural statements, and the perfunctory reminder that all present should maintain decorum. But the moment the floor opened to the incident at the ranch, the room's temperature changed. The rancher presented his evidence with methodical precision: photographs of the unauthorized sign, witness statements from neighbors, a copy of the sheriff's incident report, and the timeline of events leading to the tragic shooting of the miniature horse. Each detail painted the same picture: that an individual without legal authority had orchestrated access to private property under the guise of community action, resulting in a loss that went far beyond property damage. The board members shifted in their seats as the narrative unfolded, their carefully cultivated neutrality beginning to crumble under the weight of public scrutiny. Karen responded as she always had, with deflection. She framed her actions as a misunderstanding, insisting that her intent had been to encourage responsible land use, and claiming that the hunters had acted independently. She produced a handful of emails, none of which contained explicit authorization, but which she argued demonstrated her due diligence. To some in the room, her words might have once held sway. But now, they sounded rehearsed, hollow, and out of step with the facts laid bare. The rancher, though seething beneath the surface, did not allow the hearing to devolve into shouting. He let the evidence speak. He let the neighbors speak, those who had seen Karen at the gate, those who had been told this was a sanctioned event, those who had grown tired of her unchecked authority over a neighborhood that was never meant to bow to her whims. As the hours passed, the hearing shifted from an inquiry into a reckoning. Questions were asked that Karen could not easily answer, Why had she fabricated a sign bearing the HOA's name? Why had she not contacted the ranch owner, knowing full well the property was private? Why had she dismissed the injury to a therapy animal as though it were a minor inconvenience? The board recessed briefly, and in that interlude, the hallway filled with hushed conversations. Some whispered about lawsuits, others speculated how deep Karen's overreach had truly gone. For years, she had issued fines for trivial matters, a mailbox a shade too bright, a garden bed that did not meet her standards, and now, those patterns of control were being dissected with fresh outrage. When the board returned, it was clear that unity had fractured. Two members distanced themselves from Karen outright, citing the mounting pressure from both residents and the sheriff's department. Others hedged, speaking of further investigation, but no longer offering their unconditional defense. Karen, for the first time in years, looked genuinely unsettled. The hearing concluded without a final verdict. It was not designed to deliver swift justice. It was designed to create a record, and that record now favored the rancher. The board announced the formation of an independent review panel, a measure that sounded bureaucratic but was, in truth, a public admission that things had gone too far to sweep quietly under the rug. As the crowd dispersed, the lines of division in the neighborhood became clearer than ever. Some residents lingered to shake the rancher's hand or offer quiet words of support. Others avoided Karen's gaze as she exited, her usual confident stride replaced by a stiff march toward her car. Back at the ranch, the boy watched the sunset from the porch, the field stretching quiet and empty before him. His father returned late, the weight of the day evident in his movements, but there was a faint shift in the air, the first sign that accountability might, at last, be on the horizon. The ground where Jasper lay had been marked with a small wooden post, a reminder that the story was not over, that the loss was still raw. But outside forces were stirring. The rancher had received word from the sheriff that the hunters were being questioned, their firearms temporarily confiscated pending investigation. Civil lawyers, hearing of the case through growing online chatter, began reaching out with offers of representation. And the HOA board, once an unassailable wall behind Karen, was now showing cracks large enough for sunlight to slip through. Karen, however, was not retreating. She began a campaign of her own, late-night emails to the HOA mailing list, framing herself as a victim of a smear campaign orchestrated by anti-community forces. She hinted at counterclaims, at defamation suits, at an alleged conspiracy to discredit her. It was the posture of someone who had built their authority on fear and was now desperate to rebuild it before it crumbled completely. What she failed to see was how much had already shifted. The neighborhood was no longer intimidated. The rancher was no longer isolated. And the loss of Jasper, far from being a private tragedy, had become a rallying cry for boundaries, for respect, for the basic principle that property lines meant something, even to those who fancied themselves the arbiters of everyone else's lives. As the next hearing loomed and the sheriff's inquiry deepened, the rancher began to prepare for the next phase. This was no longer just about exposing Karen's overreach. It was about setting a precedent that would outlast her reign. The thought of courtrooms, of depositions, of headlines, no longer seemed distant, they felt inevitable. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the ranch settled into night. But this was not the same quiet that had followed Jasper's death. This was a charged quiet, the stillness before the next step, the pause in a story that had only just begun to show its full depth. Because the fight was no longer just over a field or a fence. It was about who truly held the right to decide what happened on this land, and how far one woman would go before the consequences finally closed in around her.